Hey everyone, Animeoko is here. I want to talk about visual storytelling. As a super visual person, I'm someone who really values images, but I also care about storytelling at the same time, so I want to talk about both of those put together, which would be visual storytelling. Obviously, you can see a lot of this in movies, you can see a lot of this in animated shows, in comics, in manga, anime, all that stuff. One of the things that I've been noticing is the ratio of text in, like, let's just say a comic, and the amount of panels there are on a page. Now, when I was going through like European comics, for example, something I noticed was that the page would be split up into more panels. And because of that, it would give a bit more of a cinematic feel to it because there wouldn't be too many speech bubbles within each panel. When I looked at like comics, like American comics, for example, or if I looked at manga, certain stories found that there was a lot more speech bubbles per panel, like that ratio like increased. One Piece is a good example of this, where like one panel will have heaps of speech bubbles. It's just like multiple characters talking. Hana Hana does this as well. And I personally found a preference for more of that European kind of style where there is like more panels and the speech bubbles are kind of split up between the panels. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that like I'm finding my favorite shows or my favorite series in these European comics. Like I found 3 that I really like, but you know, like a lot of my favorites definitely come from like manga and, you know, other mediums. Like European comics is more of a new medium for myself. What I really like about it is that it feels like cinematic. Like it feels like you're watching a movie because in movies the screen is constantly moving, right? Like you're constantly panning to like different shots and things like that as the characters are talking. And in this format, when you have more panels, because your eyes constantly like moving on the page, it can also feel like it's cinematic. It can feel like things are kind of moving across the page. And I really like that because I like feeling a sense of momentum when I'm like reading, when I'm reading a series. I really like that momentum. It's hard to find that feeling of momentum when there's too many speech bubbles per panel, because what ends up happening is you focus on that panel and then you have to read each of the speech bubbles, and then that momentum just kind of dissipates. Now, sometimes that is necessary when you're like kind of giving information or you want the reader to kind of like slow down a bit and just take in what that information is saying, so I can completely understand that. But I also think that you can provide information in a way that still feels cinematic, you know? Like you can have a character talking, that's one of the panels, and then maybe he has like a lighter and then he flicks the lighter and then that's another panel as he gives information. And then the fire comes out of the lighter and then that's another panel that gives information. So it's like there's different ways to kind of make things feel more cinematic, more moving, even within like the comic medium. Now, I do want to add, there are like manga and comics and stuff that do this. You know, you just have to find the right creators that aligns with your preferences. And I'm also not fully sure if this is a quality thing or a preference thing. So, for example, like, you know, my mind is like, yeah, this is like high quality, but I'm not really sure if that's actually true. Like, for example, for some people, like there's so many, especially in the American comic scene, there's so many comics where there's a lot of speech bubbles per like the panel. They really like doing these splash pages and then just having like heaps of speech bubbles around it, and it doesn't really like flow in the kind of sequential art way. It's kind of treated as like this really beautiful image, but you're not really like traveling through the image. You're taking the image on as a whole and then you like kind of read the speech bubbles. Now that's being made heaps, and you know, heaps of people love like American comics. So I'm more inclined to think that this is more of like a preference thing where I want things to feel more cinematic, versus like I think a lot of people do actually enjoy like just having like a really pretty page to kind of look at and then having speech bubbles around it or in it that gives the story, but maybe they don't really need that sense of movement. You know, maybe for people who want that sense of movement, they tend to just go for like animated shows, or they'll watch anime or they watch movies because they're like, well, if you want something with movement, why aren't you just watching those? And I do watch those, but I also have like this love for like manga and comics, so I want that kind of movement and feeling of just a being cinematic, like within my comics and manga and stuff like that as well. So I really enjoy that. I'm not really sure if that's like a preference thing, if that's like a quality thing, you know what I mean? Like I would argue, like if you want a scene to like breathe and feel alive, you know, in that moment, you can say that is a quality thing. Like you do need to make scenes cinematic, especially big scenes. Like that's always done, regardless of what series we're talking about. Like when you have a big scene, an emotional scene, a cathartic scene, they make the scene, like they'll make the moment feel cinematic, whether it's manga, comics, doesn't matter what it is. They'll generally do that. They'll generally, you know, have a bit more panels leading up to it to actually have that moment. You know, there's a kind of sincerity in that moment that's just required. And I feel like that is more of like a quality thing. But what I'm asking for is for that kind of feeling to exist all throughout, you know, like just all throughout. So, and that's why I think it might be more of a preference thing rather than like a quality assertion. Like it's only really a quality assertion scene by scene. But if you want it throughout like your whole series, then it might just be more of a preference thing, you know what I mean? But either way, like one thing I really like is like a lot of shows like the X-Files, or like there's like kind of mystery based shows where they don't really like say that much, which is interesting because X-Files is like a detective show, but they don't really say that much, especially at the start. They just have this opening sequence, you know, characters are kind of doing things, and then we see like something happening in the shadows, but there's a lot of silence, like a lot is conveyed through the silence, and then some horrible attack happens, and then that's kind of like the opening scene. And then even as they're working through the cases, there's always heaps of these scenes where they go into like a new place, and then they have to kind of check it out and see if there's any threats. And you know, a lot is said through that silence, a lot is said through not having a lot of dialogue. Like there's heaps of ways to portray information through just like visually. I always remember this scene from like One Punch Man where like I think in the manga, you know, the oxygen or the lack of gravity or something like that, when he gets hit to the moon. But then in the anime, they kind of just show him like throw a rock up and look at it levitating, and then he like gets off. Like kind of giving the same information just through like a visual showcase. So you can also like provide information visually as well. Like it's not just like the visuals are an accompaniment for the words. I mean, that's personally how I prefer. Like as in, like I do enjoy visual storytelling just by itself as well. But like what I'm really kind of looking for is kind of yeah, like dialogue moving with the visuals as the scene is like progressing, you know? Yeah, just a lot can be said through that silence as well. And back to that topic from before about like just letting scenes breathe. Like the more panels you have, the more the scene itself can take a breath, you know? Like when you're having like an opening sequence to just to set the scene and to set the tone, it helps kind of pull the person into the scene and really kind of ground them in the atmosphere. Like having more panels can really, using more visual storytelling really helps set the mood, which I think I really like. And also just with those big scenes, like when you actually have the visuals talk for themselves, the kind of sense I get from the creator is that they have complete faith in the scene that they're constructing. You know, and sometimes you just kind of need a breather, you know, especially when you're just getting overloaded with information. You kind of just want to have a bit of a breather from all of the text and just see something visually depicted to you. Also, when you're giving information, one thing I really like to see is when a series has like different facial expressions alongside the text. So someone will say something, let's just say a sentence, and then another character will have a reaction to said sentence. And that makes it feel like the dialogue is important, like what's being said is really important, and it's not just random interactions happening, and that, you know, that character itself is also taking in what they're saying. So there is also like visual importance in those scenes as well. Now, I want to give like an example of like a series that I read that really did it well in my opinion. So Kekkai Sensen, or Blood Blockade Battlefront, like it has its third iteration, which is called 3 Beat, I think. And it put out this chapter and it has a lot of silence, but there wasn't much confusion at all. And it's just, you know, things are progressing, characters are still talking and stuff. But this entire narrative is kind of constructed, and this is like the second episode, and it's actually giving like huge reveals about the world, but it's done really well through just kind of visual storytelling, and the characters themselves feel kind of more alive in a certain way, because like their dialogue when they do speak feels really specific because it's very intentionally done. Now, I don't even like pure silence, like chapters or anything like that. Like for example, like I love BoJack Horseman, but there's an episode where they're underwater and the characters just don't speak. And, I think it's pretty highly regarded, but I just don't like it. Because to me, that's just way too much like visual storytelling. That's way too much. I still want dialogue, personally. So, I just want things to feel like cinematic. That's my personal preference. Like another example is like, in One Piece or something, like, I like where prior to, I think, like Enies Lobby, or during Enies Lobby, I think that's when it kind of stopped. Like Oda would show a lot of like the wind up to attacks. So he would show like the punch clenching, and then you see another panel of it coming forth, and then you see the actual panel of the attack. So rather than like a screenshot of like an impact shot with a lot of dialogue around, it makes the page itself beautiful because it's a nice action shot, but it doesn't actually feel like there's like a lot of movement. While later One Piece, it has a lot more of that kind of just that big impact shot with like a lot of dialogue around. Now, I do have to admit that like as I'm kind of putting all of this together, when I think of like visual storytelling, I'm thinking of like visuals conveying like information, or like conveying like a certain sense of something. And like in One Piece, for example, there's heaps of characters just talking over one another, and I have a preference to not like that kind of stuff. But when I think about it, like if you want to like convey visually that this is like a group of people that are constantly engaging with the world and engaging with each other, then you would have to like set the panels like that if that's the kind of vibe that you're going for. So, that is also like visual storytelling now that I think about it like more clearly. So like I do think this is more like a preference thing, and that I do just have like more of a fundamental need for things to feel cinematic just as I'm experiencing it. Like I have a preference for just like two characters just talking to each other, and then also, as I said before, character says something, then you see like the reaction of another character, and then they say something back, and that's like a whole kind of panel layout. But if you have multiple characters in a scene, and that's the kind of writer you are constantly, then it doesn't really make that much sense to have those kind of moments unless they're supposed to be like an intimate moment between two characters. But I'm like, no, I want every scene to kind of be like that. I want it to kind of feel kind of close, kind of intimate. Like even as, as I'm reflecting, like when I'm talking about like being able to convey dialogue alongside like visuals and having like a low amount of dialogue per panel, I'm kind of wanting there to be like a focus or a close-up on just different objects in the scene, whether it's the face, whether it's, that lighter or that I was talking about before. It's like I do prefer like close-ups more than like kind of like this landscape kind of view with like different characters interacting, which is what One Piece does a lot. Like you'll have like one panel, there's like 4 different characters in it, and they're all getting their opinion out. So if you really want to feel like there's this world and there's all these characters and they're all interacting with the environment around them and each other, then the thing that I'm kind of describing, like in the way that I want it to be, it's not really that possible. Like if you can't actually convey that dynamicism between characters if you're constantly like kind of doing like this focus shot. But I prefer the focus shot. Like I prefer less wide angle things and more kind of focused things. So yeah, and that's the kind of visual storytelling that I have a preference for. So I am kind of like seeing more that this is more of a preference thing, but I guess like if I did have like a critique, it would be that I do think that there are kind of certain scenes and certain structures that do definitely require this kind of visual storytelling that I'm talking about, and they are the more silent scenes and they are the more emotional scenes where you can't rush through it. Like you really have to pace that scene if you really want that scene to have an impact, and that does require the kind of visual storytelling that I'm personally talking about. But yeah, just as like a summary, like the main thing I want to see more of is kind of like more manga and comics where it feels like there is constant movement in the pages. Like that's what I want it to feel like, and that is definitely my favorite kind. Keen to see what you guys think. Like what is your kind of favorite style of visual storytelling? Like how do you want your story to be told to you? I think those are like important questions to find the kind of things that you want to engage with. So yeah, keen to see what you guys think, and I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Okay, take care. Bye.